In today's video, we're going to examine a document that was instrumental in the decision of the Cheshire Constabulary to further investigate the situation at the Countess of Chester. This document was primarily authored by Dr. Stephen Brearey, although other consultants that worked on the unit may have had some input. This document preceded a critical meeting that took place on the 15th of May 2017, at which Dr. Brearey and Dr. Ravi Jairam were in attendance. The document they're going to examine today was submitted to Cheshire Police 5 days prior to this, on the 10th of May 2017. In the 29th column written by Dr. Philip Hammond for Private Eye on the topic of the Lucy Letby trial, Philip Hammond writes that on the 4th of May 2017, Dr. Brearey emailed his colleagues detailing tweaks to this document, including, "I've added a paragraph saying acuity and staffing is irrelevant." Philip Hammond notes that he has not been able to find a neonatologist or paediatrician to agree that those factors were irrelevant to these cases. As you can see, this document is INQ 0102301 in the Thirlwell inquiry. It's published on the 20th of November 2024, but it was actually submitted to the Cheshire Constabulary on the 10th of May 2017. Finally, I'd just like to point out that it was actually sent by Dr. Jairam to Nigel Wenham, who acknowledged receipt of the document. It's just worth pointing out that this was something that was put together by Dr. Brearey. Dr. Brearey was the driving force behind this document being sent, and indeed was the driving force behind Lucy Letby being fingered for the whole thing. He was very much involved, centrally involved, in what occurred on the unit. And he had to convince the other paediatricians, the other consultants, even Dr. Ravi Jairam had to be convinced by Brearey. Brearey was absolutely the ringleader of what occurred. But when it came down to sending the actual document to the police, he wasn't quite so keen to do that. And you'll find he was very shrewd in a lot of things that he did, where he did everything to ensure that the police looked at the case, and he did everything that he could ensure. In today's video, we're going to examine that he wasn't directly involved in it. So this document has the rather snappy title of Reasons for Concerns Regarding a Possible Criminal Cause for Increased Neonatal Mortality at the Countess of Chester Hospital NHS Foundation Trust, June 2015 to July 2016. It's not really worth going over the content. There isn't an enormous amount of substance to this document. It's a lot like one of Dr. Evans' reports. You know, we have seen one of Dr. Evans' reports. At some point, I'll probably go over that, and you'll see how poor it is in terms of quality. This is another document. There's a very poor standard. But we'll just go through the actual text. So the document begins with a summary here. The historical annual number of deaths on the neonatal unit at the hospital has been between 1 and 3. From June 2015, there were 13 deaths in the 13 months. The probability of this increase in mortality occurring by chance alone is very low. So firstly, I think it's reasonable to say that that's a fair statement. Probably the probability of that amount of increase occurring by chance alone is low. It should be said that it can't be ruled out entirely. This could have occurred entirely due to chance. Obviously, that's not the most likely explanation, but just because you see a spike in deaths, it doesn't mean that there has to be a very specific underlying reason. If you ran this in for an infinite amount of time, the NHS as a system, eventually you would get this many deaths, and indeed you would get more deaths than this. That's something that people don't understand about probability generally. Obviously, these doctors, whether willingly or unwillingly, don't understand this about probability. Nonetheless, the notion that this probably didn't occur by chance is a fair one. The thing is that Dr. Brearey wishes to blame Lucy Letby for this statistical anomaly. when we know now that it was issues related to the unit that were far more compelling, and that Dr. Brearey, as we've already seen, he was very keen to completely rule out such eventualities. And we've seen that throughout the whole investigation and the whole period at the Countess of Chester Hospital. They go straight to the Royal College. When the Royal College are coming to investigate the hospital, they go straight to the Royal College and say, "Oh, we suspect Lucy Letby." In a few days' time, they'll go to the police and they'll say immediately, "We suspect Lucy Letby." They did everything possible to eliminate any consideration of any other factors on the unit, such as the poor condition of the unit and their personal mistakes. So I don't disagree with that statement. It's just that the contributing factors to the increase in deaths were never considered by the hospital and were certainly discounted by Dr. Brearey. So then he goes on to say, many of the babies who died were born at gestations where death is statistically very unlikely. So as we continue into this document, we'll see why this is a flawed statement. But actually, when we look at the infants that ultimately appeared in the court case who died, there were some other cases where supposedly unexplained collapses or supposedly unanticipated collapses were cited for certain infants, and that those cases are all phenomenally weak. Of course, that there are serious problems with the children that died, but perhaps some of them did die in less than optimal circumstances. But this assertion that Dr. Brearey makes here about the babies being born at gestations where death is statistically very unlikely does not stand up to scrutiny as you continue through this document. So I'm moving to the second paragraph. Of the babies who died, most deteriorated unexpectedly without explanation at the time or subsequently. Now, of course, we now know that what they believe to be unexpected deteriorations can in fact be explained. They just didn't have the skills on the unit to understand what was happening. And I think this is quite evident from these early paragraphs of this document. The next statement Dr. Brearey makes is, it is very unusual not to see any clinical evidence of a baby becoming unwell. That's absolutely true. But let's read the second half of this sentence before we address that. For example, you might expect to see their heart beating faster or the level of oxygen in their blood changing. So it seems to me that the consultants on the unit were looking for very rudimentary physical signs of deterioration, and they simply missed the clinical signs. We know that now anyway. They say that there was no clinical evidence, but in actual fact, they just simply didn't note the clinical evidence. Now, it's really up to interpretation as to why they didn't do that. It seems to me that it's not unreasonable to describe them as incompetent, because there were all manner of very obvious clinical signs. Later in this document, we will see Dr. Brearey talking about child C. There is no reference to a bowel obstruction, even though there are very explicit signs of a bowel obstruction. It seems inconceivable that these could have been missed, but seemingly they were either entirely missed or for some bizarre reason discounted on the unit. Now, I don't have a good explanation for why that would be. That's something that Dr. Brearey would need to explain for himself. So when he says it's very unusual not to see any clinical evidence, there may be clinical conditions. Of course, I'm certainly not a paediatrician. I'm not any kind of medic. There may be clinical conditions that are life-threatening in which the clinical evidence is incredibly difficult to spot. I'm sure that's probably true. However, in these cases, I don't think the clinical evidence was necessarily that difficult to spot. In some cases, it may have been, but the fact is, more experienced, more qualified people with more expertise who are just better doctors than these people, and Dr. Brearey in particular, did spot the clinical signs just from the notes, let alone did they need to be on the unit examining the babies. Had they been on the unit examining the babies, I think it's fair to say many of these infants would have been saved. It's quite possible they wouldn't have had any deaths at all. So I'll continue with the next sentence. In some of these cases, there was no recovery to adequate resuscitation measures. So again, the reason for this is that by the time resuscitation was attempted, the infants were no longer in a physical state where they were able to recover from their ailments, and therefore resuscitation was unsuccessful. It seems that Dr. Brearey has a very narrow notion of what could go wrong with a neonate and reasons why a neonate may collapse. And this could be due to a lack of experience, it could be due to a lack of ability, it could be due to the fact they hadn't dealt with this acuity of infants before, even though Dr. Brearey wishes to discount that completely. So the fact that the infants didn't immediately recover to resuscitation, that would be seen as a red flag. But in fact, the red flags were all there. They just missed all of the red flags. In today's video, now I just want to mention at this point that so much of what Dr. Stephen Brearey and the paediatricians on the unit and this entire case comes down to is the human determination to find patterns in everything that we encounter, really, and then draw conclusions from those patterns. So I've previously mentioned this idea of the lottery numbers. Now, I will say I asked ChatGPT to draw me a lottery draw with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. It has failed on that, and it's only drawn a lottery draw with 5 numbers. I will say its drawing is still a lot better than mine. So obviously this is not quite right. There should be 6 numbers. But if you had a national lottery draw and the numbers came out as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it would be extremely surprising. It would look extremely weird to our human eyes. But in actual fact, it's no more surprising than any other lottery draw. And indeed, if you ran a simulation of the national lottery draw, say 100 billion times, it would definitely happen, or it would be statistically very likely to happen. It's not a meaningful pattern. And there can be meaningful patterns. There can be a spike within cases. But just because you're not expecting that to happen doesn't mean that there aren't underlying reasons. But of course, it was absolutely right for the paediatricians to wonder why these deaths were occurring on the unit. But instead of looking at the medical circumstances surrounding the deaths, they looked at another statistical anomaly, which is that one nurse was around a lot of the time. But in actual fact, the more you look at those two things, when you look at the acuity of babies that they were dealing with, when you look at the fact there were a lot of twins and triplets in this selection of infants that were in the indictment, when you look at the fact that many of these infants should have been born at other hospitals and certainly should have been treated at other hospitals, and it seems that the organisation of the North West region was, to be generous, suboptimal. When you put all of these things together, it's not surprising that there were collapses. And then on top of that, when you consider that Lucy was doing more shifts, it's known, the nurses said explicitly in 2016 on several occasions, we entrust her with some of the higher risk babies. And obviously they were understaffed. They had bank staff that they were using. They had part-time staff that they were using. You put all that together, then these patterns are not surprising. But perhaps for what could be considered self-serving reasons, the consultants are determined, particularly Dr. Brearey, to read things into those patterns that aren't there. So just as you could see a lottery draw here, even 5 numbers, even 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, may not happen. You may do thousands, millions, potentially even a billion. I'm not sure what the precise statistical, I'm not going to calculate it, but you may do many, many, many lottery draws before you see 5 consecutive numbers come out like this, or even any 5 consecutive numbers, let alone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that doesn't mean there's any underlying or meaningful reason for that. It's just a random draw, and it would happen sooner or later if you did it often enough. Similarly, if you had the circumstance at the Countess of Chester happen often enough, or if you just simulated the NHS as a whole often enough, you would have similar results in other hospitals, and indeed eventually you would have worse results, particularly with the conditions that were prevalent at the Countess of Chester. And this is just something that seems to have been not understood. That's the most generous interpretation I can make of why Dr. Brearey became so fixated with this idea that Lucy Letby was a presence and therefore there was some sort of meaningful underlying reason for that. In today's video, so this document then continues by saying exactly what I've just discussed. There is an association with a member of staff who was present during the majority of instances when the babies unexpectedly deteriorated. So it's fairly remarkable for me that we can see this argument that just has no merit whatsoever being used, and I can't understand. I've shown you the documents where they become that even when the first deaths occur in June 2015, they're already looking to see if there's a commonality, and already by July, Dr. Stephen Brearey is thinking there's a bit of a commonality. It could be Lucy, and then he becomes fixated on this idea. Now, there are different interpretations of why that occurred, but let's assume that this all occurred in good faith for the sake of argument. It's still extraordinary to me that they would continue to go down this route with absolutely no evidence, and you will see in this document they provide no meaningful evidence whatsoever. It is just this coincidence, what the police themselves describe as a coincidence, that Lucy happens to be on duty, although that's not such a big coincidence because, I've had statisticians on. I'm going to have more statisticians on in the future, and they will tell you that the statistical inference that appeared in court, which was even slightly refined compared to what we see in this document, even that just has no merit whatsoever, and it's that chart is just statistically, scientifically worthless. So I think it's incredible, particularly as we know Dr. Saladi wrote to Dr. Brearey and say, we should contact the police now. This was in June, I believe, June or July 2016, possibly July 2016. Dr. Saladi writes to Dr. Brearey saying, we should contact the police now, we should be among the suspects. And Dr. Brearey did everything possible to ensure that never happened. He wanted it to be referred to the police, and he spent, months, 10 months from there, trying to ensure that happened. But when he did, he made sure the consultants were never suspects. And he obviously, as I've demonstrated at the start of this video, as I've demonstrated in previous videos, he took the minimum risk possible for himself. So I'll continue with this document from here. When this member of staff was put onto day shifts for 3 months, no sudden collapses occurred during the night. So we could examine this in more depth. I've examined this in my book. All I will say is that this is, again, just a statistical coincidence. This could happen to anyone. It must have happened in another hospital. If you traced the NHS back and if you went statistically through everything that has ever happened at every hospital, this will definitely have happened somewhere else. Except, perhaps there's the possibility that another hospital hasn't moved someone off night shifts after a period of death because they didn't jump to such conclusions. So it's just a rather asinine statement, and yet it's a statement that was taken seriously. It was a statement that was taken seriously by the police. It was a statement that was advanced as evidence. It was a statement that appeared in court. So even in this very rudimentary document that's been knocked together by Stephen Brearey, that really is not difficult to pull apart, that very, very early focus on the commonality of Lucy Letby that was submitted to the police before they'd start to investigate, we still see arguments from this very crude document appearing in the court case, being delivered by barristers who are being paid astronomical, almost obscene amounts of money to deliver the case at times. Let's continue. Previous to this change in her work pattern in 6 out of 9 deaths, the arrests occurred between midnight and 4 a.m. When this so I won't read the next sentence because the next sentence talks about Lucy being taken off the unit. So in this sentence, again, this is just really continuing the coincidence theory of the previous sentence. It's just not something that has any merit at all. You would think that this would be allied to some sort of meaningful observation at some point, but it never is. And then it just continues. When this member of staff was no longer working on the unit, July 2016 to present, there have been no neonatal deaths on the unit and no unexpected or unexplained sudden deteriorations. This member of staff was present on the unit during the deterioration of the babies who died. So we'll look at that, the babies who died in a second that he's citing. Note the fact that he doesn't mention here immediately that they're dealing with different gestational babies. He does go on to mention this in the next paragraph, so we'll assess that in a second. Let's just zoom in on these infants here. So, as you can see, essentially, we can't see all of the letters for all of them. So it's hard to know whether this relates to all of the infants that were in the court case. I assume that it does. But basically, there's a certain percentage that are not on the indictment, and they're anonymised. But you'll see later on how many infants are anonymised in this document as a whole. But it's difficult to know exactly what's behind those letters because the document hasn't been put together adequately by the person that's anonymised the infants. But I would assume that these are the infants that appeared in the court case. What we will see is for the infants that appeared in the court case, the next paragraph, the statements in the next paragraph are completely incorrect. So the gestation at birth of the babies who died was between 26 weeks and 40 weeks. 6 babies were over 32 weeks gestation. So by the time you edit out all of the non-indictment infants that we'll see later in this document, I'm not going to assess that statement at this point because I want to show you what happens later in the document first. But by the time that is edited out, this statement is just simply incorrect. The redesignation of the unit from July 2016 only permitted to care for babies over 32 weeks gestation cannot therefore be the only reason why there have been no deaths or sudden unexplained deteriorations of babies on the unit since July 2016. That is correct. No one is saying that it's the only reason, but it can be a significant reason as to why, if you go from a situation where you're dealing with infants that you've never dealt with before, in large numbers, in cramped conditions, etc., then all of a sudden, in a short period of time, you can have major problems. And then when that is compounded by the mismanagement and poor care of these infants, or when that is further compounded by poor sanitary conditions, and when that is further compounded by specific medical errors, then you can get the sort of so-called unexplained deteriorations that occurred on this unit. Of course, another central factor in this, we've heard this when I've interviewed nurses, we've heard this in previous videos, is the lack of monitoring on the unit, it's the lack of ward rounds, it's the poor level of staffing and the poor level of skilling on the unit, where they made people redundant, where they brought in inexperienced staff, where they brought in temporary staff. So they were unable to perform the level of observation that is critical in order to spot the clinical signs that are all too evident in these infants. And I've been informed so many times, and it's very, very clear, and it makes mincemeat of the ludicrous suggestion that we heard. I mean, essentially, it's suggested by Brearey and J-Ram. Then it's suggested by Dr. Evans. Then the police say it. Then the police pass it on to the Crown Prosecution Service. Then it appears in court. Then we hear the police repeat it again. This suggestion that, you always know when a neonate is going to collapse. All of their collapses are predictable. And when you actually speak to people that work on neonatal units who are either neonatal nurses or experienced neonatologists, they will just absolutely rubbish this. So when they think, firstly, there were explanations for these deteriorations to say that unexplained is incorrect, but the explanations can be missed and they can appear to be unexplained if you don't do a good job of monitoring the infants, because they can deteriorate very rapidly, and if you don't know the reasons and if you haven't seen the clinical signs as to why that occurred, then of course they may appear to be unexplained deteriorations. If you put me on the unit as a doctor and I was examining the infants and an infant deteriorated, I mean, I've learned so much about neonates, I might actually be able to look at some basic things or at least suggest something. Certainly 3 years ago I wouldn't have had a clue, and even now it's very obvious that I could miss the signs of deterioration because I'm not qualified to do it. These gentlemen that were paediatricians were certainly far better qualified than me, but it seems based on their practice and it seems based on what is easily observable on this unit that they weren't good enough to be able to observe the clinical signs that led to these deteriorations. In today's video, so in my previous interview with Dr. Martin Pittman that was recorded just over a month ago, we discussed the background to child A and child B, and Martin mentioned this condition of lupus. It has a longer name, but as I don't have that in front of me, I'm not going to attempt to remember it. Maternal SLE is sometimes referred to as well. So we have the documents that indicate they were aware of this on the unit at the time, but this somehow mysteriously disappeared from any discussion related to while child A may have collapsed. So I'll read out this post on Facebook by Rosie Burton, who's done lots of fantastic work online. Child A's mother tested positive for lupus antibodies. That's known to be the case. Dr. Brearey initially noted her lupus as the cause of her son's death. That's known to be the case. We have the documents for that. Blood tests and autopsies can't rule out lupus in babies who die of a sudden cardiac arrest, but they can confirm it. The arrest itself is an important indicator of the condition, sometimes the only indicator. So I'm not going to read through all of this because it's quite complicated, and we've discussed it previously in the interview with Martin, so I recommend you have a look at that. But it was known that lupus was a significant factor, an important factor in the background of this mother. Then we also know that the mother had antiphospholipid syndrome and that this can be passed to the infant, as well as gestational cholestasis that for some reason is not charted in the medical records, in common with lupus that somehow seems to have been noted as the cause of death, seems to have been noted as being part of the clinical picture, then seems to have mysteriously disappeared for some reason. So when we look at the panel's explanation, they explain about antiphospholipid syndrome, about how the antibodies can pass through the placenta to the neonate and lead to thromboembolism. I recently saw a presentation in which it was explained. I've explained it previously. It's been explained by far more qualified and credentialed people than me on this channel, that what was said in court in relation to this, that can the child inherit the antibodies, is the question that was answered in court. That's not what is being suggested. It's not being suggested that they were inherited. It's being suggested that the antibodies were passed through the placenta via this known process, particularly, as stated here, if there is concurrent infection. And then the post-mortem of child A showed a recent non-occluding thrombus in the liver, which means there was a recent thrombotic event. On the day of collapse, baby 1 had 2 central catheters that were left without infusion for up to 4 hours, which predisposed to thrombosis when there is no infusion. So there were many mistakes with this infant as well. I believe this was another infant in which there were problems with intubation, which is also mentioned by the panel. But the ultimate verdict with child A was that the infant died from thrombosis. Of course, there is no evidence of embolism for this infant. It's almost ridiculous to suggest, given the clinical signs, the clinical picture, what we know about the mother, what we know about the child, what we know about the vital signs and the clinical signs of the infant, to suggest that this infant died due to embolism is frankly ridiculous. And then if we move on to child I, this was already an infant that was suffering and vulnerable from birth, contrary to what Dr. Brearey suggested earlier in this document. So this is a very small, very premature infant suffering with intrauterine growth restriction, born after premature rupture of membranes at Liverpool Women's Hospital. So we can say with absolute certainty this infant should never have been anywhere near the Countess of Chester Hospital. Having been born at Liverpool Women's Hospital, this infant should have been treated at a tertiary unit. There's a lot more background details to this infant, but the way that it's characterised in Dr. Brearey's document is that these infants were all over 32 weeks and they all collapsed for absolutely no reason. Obviously, that is without foundation when you actually look at the infants themselves. As is stated here, there's bradycardia, respiratory distress, elevated white count, leading to 5 transfers to 4 hospitals by the 12th day of their life. There's no way that should have happened. I mean, I'm pretty sure that I can't imagine any medical professional would defend that. The only way would be if the infant. I mean, I can't even think of a possible scenario. There could possibly be a scenario where, due to some catastrophic circumstances, there weren't enough beds in a tertiary unit, and so the infant had to be transferred out for some reason, and then they transferred the infant back, and then there was some other calamity, and then it becomes pretty unfeasible. But there can be no justification for 5 transfers in 12 days for what is a very vulnerable infant. And even the hospital themselves, they admitted in documents we transferred the infants around too much, and that could have contributed to their conditions. So the infant develops chronic lung disease, abdominal distension, recurrent episodes of apnea, desaturation and bradycardia requiring resuscitation and ventilation. She had viscous gelatinous secretions from her airway and mouth that were associated with frequent blockages of our endotracheal tube and sticky stool. So again, this is not even the full picture. This is just one paragraph indicating the catalogue of problems that child A was suffering with. Whereas Dr. Brearey writes to the police and says, the infants were absolutely fine. They were barely even premature. They all collapsed for no reason. We're none the wiser as to why it occurred. So child I ultimately died of respiratory complications caused by respiratory distress syndrome and chronic lung disease complicated by Stretophomonas multifilia colonization. The doctors failed to respond to surveillance warnings about Stretophomonas multifilia, did not recognise the diagnosis and did not treat her with the appropriate antibiotics, not the first mistake with antibiotics on this unit. This was a likely preventable death. There is no evidence of air causing splintering of the diaphragm or of air embolism. Again, it's frankly surreal that this was even suggested. There's evidence the apnea alarm was not turned off. So I'm not going to go through child O and child P because in the near future I will be speaking with Dr. Pittman again, and we're going to go through the twins and the backgrounds of the twins, and that will probably take quite a long time. So we'll go into some detail during that video. The background of those infants is fairly well established, but we will discuss that at this time. But you can see from child A and child I that the actual clinical picture is completely different to how it's presented by Dr. Brearey. So let's go back to the document. We're continuing from here. Further to her report, a consensus between 3 Countess of Chester paediatricians and an external neonatologist from the Liverpool Women's Hospital have identified a further 4 babies and a 5th baby, seemingly, for whom the cause of death is still unexplained. Slightly confusing thing because there are only 4 infants listed there, and it seems to imply there are 5. But anyway, 2 of those 4 infants aren't in the indictment, and the other 2 infants are child C and child D. Now, I'm not going to go over all the details of child C and child D at this point in time because we've done that previously, and I'll probably do it again in the future. Child C is a very obvious bowel obstruction, and child D is such unbelievably poor care was given to this infant. This infant was definitely suffering, but this infant could have survived. I mean, that's very clear. The more that I've spoken to people, the more that I've realised that. I mean, it's been a learning curve for me in understanding what occurred on the unit, and I'm learning more every day. Hardly a day goes by where I don't learn something new about this case. It was very, very clear that now that child D was treated very poorly, and frankly, the hospital could have faced legal action if Lucy Letby hadn't have been charged, and that's not me saying that. They were advised that by the lawyer Ian Pace. So, of those 4 babies, 2 of them are in the court case, and 2 of them, one of them, the hospital cocked up so badly, they're lucky they didn't face legal action, and the other one, we already know. We know why child C demised. It's absolutely obvious. It's blindingly obvious, and the fact that was overturned, and this with this, obviously child C is this surreal case in which the day of the incident is moved around, and I'm going to be making a video about that soon because there's stuff about that hasn't come out yet. So I'm going to be revealing some more information about child C and about the background to Dr. Evans and child C that no one knows at this point in time. An unexplained rash was observed for at least 3 babies, so we can dismiss this completely. We know that has no basis. It's just an indication of circulatory collapse. It's just the rashes weren't even consistent. This can just be dismissed. This was initially thought to be due to infection by the clinical teams. However, the rashes resolved spontaneously despite the babies being very ill. This is highly unusual and may indicate a possible unnatural cause of death. Well, there were unnatural causes of death, but I mean, you're just plain wrong in your observations. So there's no point in going over that any further. We've been over it before. We will probably go over it again. The increase in neonatal mortality did not coincide with any significant changes in acuity or staffing levels in 2015 and 2016. So I suppose, I think this is absolutely untrue with regard to staffing levels. However, I suppose you could argue that as they had inadequate staffing, and that was the case throughout 2015 and 2016, that could be described as not being a change in the situation. So staffing was inadequate throughout that period. But what he's trying he's trying to hand wave this away and say that staffing wasn't a significant factor. So we're going to examine that in a second. In terms of the acuity, there were undeniably was a significant change in acuity. That's just plain wrong. I can't believe that he possibly considers that to be a legitimate argument. But we need to have a quick look. I don't want to go over this in detail because, I've literally written entire chapters on this in my book. So there is enormous evidence pointing to significant changes in acuity, problems with acuity, and problems with staffing on the unit. Actually, let me just read the rest of this paragraph first before we demolish this sentence. So nursing staffing at the Chester neonatal unit was above the national average. I find that incredibly difficult to believe. There's just all of the evidence points to the complete opposite. If staffing on this unit was above the national average, then that wouldn't speak very well of the NHS as a whole. I know there's been a maternity crisis, but there is no doubt that this unit had significant staffing problems. So to try and characterise it as being above average is frankly ludicrous. And then the next sentence is the percentage of shifts staffed to BAPM standard was higher than other LNUs in the network and higher than the national average. I find that, again, incredibly hard to believe. I don't have statistics relating to the national average, but I find that assertion incredibly hard to believe because it was acknowledged that they didn't meet BAPM standards on the unit. Dr. Brearey, in fact, acknowledged that himself in documents that are available in the Thirlwell inquiry. So to say that their standards were higher than in other local neonatal units, in this network that wouldn't mean very much because there are hardly any units. But to claim that their performance was higher than the national average is, again, quite a surreal claim, given what we know about this unit. And then he says, high dependency and intensive care days did not change appreciably in 2015 and 2016 compared to previous years. So we don't have the data available for previous years because usually it's not made available for individual hospitals. But in terms of whether there was specifically high dependency and high requirement of intensive care at that time on this unit, there is absolutely no doubt that there was. Dr. Brearey was aware of this. Dr. Brearey made comments about this. Nurses made comments about this. Other doctors made comments about this. For him to handwave it and say, oh yeah, none of this contributed, it's just absolutely ridiculous, embarrassing. In fact, I think you could go as far as saying. But I'm going to rewind slightly and look at this notion that there were no issues related to acuity or staffing on the neonatal unit between 2015 and 2016. So there's a neonatal unit review here for the years mentioned, 2015 to 2016. The first thing is that this is compiled by Ariane Powell in May 2016. And she states, Lucy Letby also avails herself to work overtime when the acuity or unit is over capacity. So this, of course, is for the period that Dr. Brearey is referring to in his document. So maybe this is some sort of hypothetical, imaginary situation that Ariane Powell's writing about, but I think more likely is that she's writing about the conditions that actually were present on the unit. Then we see this further comment about the Cheshire and Mersey Transport Service have been involved in a few of these mortalities and they may have survived if the service was running adequately. We see these problems regarding the tertiary units and the other units that are part of this Northwest network with a facilitating cot. And I also didn't highlight number 14 where they're talking about cot availability resulting in external and additional admissions to the Countess of Chester Hospital. Then we have this other review in which it stated if one looked at nursing standards, the average amount of time compliant is 50% compared to the national average, which is 64%. Some units such as Warrington only have 20% compliance. There are strains in the system, and as the neonatal lead, Mr. Brearey could not see that any of the apparent changes in acuity or staffing levels can account for the increased mortality. So let me just emphasise that Dr. Brearey wrote in his document that there were no changes in acuity and that staffing levels were great. Then we'll move on finally to look at this document INQ00178827. This is the witness statement of Nurse X, and she said, I was aware that the unit averaged 2 to 3 deaths per year. With an increase in patient numbers, it did not surprise me that the number of babies dying had also increased. I considered that the increase in acuity had increased the mortality rate further. I did not consider intentional harm as a cause of our increased mortality. While I can see how intentional harm would increase acuity, I cannot see how it would account for the increase in admissions during this time. So I'm honestly not going to go any further than that. There are literally dozens, if not hundreds of documents pointing to the fact that they had problems with staffing and they had increased acuity. So the statements made by Dr. Brearey in this document are just plain wrong. One could say that they are deliberately misleading. So we'll go back to the document. In addition to the babies who died, there were also a significant number of babies who suffered an unexpected collapse or deterioration. So these are some of the supposedly unexpected collapses or deteriorations ultimately appeared in the court case. These are very, very weak cases, of course. The cause for the deteriorations is unknown, and the member of staff mentioned above was present on the neonatal unit for the majority of these cases. So again, just pushing this coincidence. And bear in mind, it's not even all of the cases. It's just, she was around quite a lot of the time. So obviously that must be the reason that these infants are deteriorating. The investigations undertaken by the Trust to date do not appear to have included a comprehensive analysis of staffing at the time of all the collapses and deaths. So the reason for that is that the investigations undertaken by the Trust were focusing on medical explanations for why the infants had collapsed. So there would be no particular need to look at staffing. You're not looking at staffing from an acuity perspective because you've already discounted that. You want them to look at it from the statistical coincidence perspective that you believe to be so important. The only reason for the Royal College, for example, to do that would be if they found malfeasance in the review of the infants from a medical perspective. They did not find that, so therefore there's no reason for them to do what you've described as a comprehensive analysis of staffing. I'm not sure that your own analysis of staffing could be described as comprehensive because you've gone to every length possible to ensure that there are no doctors in that analysis. So let's continue. Senior medical staff, trainee doctors and nursing staff involved with the cases listed below have not been interviewed in relation to the care given around the time of the events listed below. So firstly, you're mentioning the nursing staff. You know that's a deliberately misleading statement because you know very well that the nursing staff supported Lucy and that you were butting heads with the managers on the unit. So if you ask the nursing staff on the unit, they would simply say, the caregiving was perfectly good, Lucy's the best member of staff that we've got. You know very well that's the case. With regard to the medical staff and the trainee doctors, what they should be looking at with regard to the care given would be their own efforts, not the nursing staff, not Lucy Letby, not the care given. The care given by doctors, yes. The care given by nurses, no. And then on top of that, even if they were consulted, all they would be able to say is what you have said, because when the case was referred to the police, it was referred with no evidence, as we've established many times previously. So all the medical staff and trainee doctors could have said was, which is basically what they said in court, we don't know why the infants collapsed. A nurse was around quite a bit of the time because she did more shifts than anyone else. That's all they could have said if they were interviewed. The babies who were transferred from the unit and subsequently died, and the babies who collapsed unexpectedly and survived, do not seem to have been adequately investigated by the Trust to date. So, firstly, These are not unexpected collapses. They're collapses that you don't understand. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's a matter of opinion as to whether they were investigated adequately. There is a certain degree of argument that there could be further clinical work done to try to fully establish the cause of death. Of course, that's now been done by a world-class panel of neonatologists. But there could have been a multidisciplinary review. Dr. Jairam mentioned a multidisciplinary review in the infamous 15th of May meeting. So there could have been such an investigation, but you wanted the case to go to the police. The police are obviously not suited to run a multidisciplinary review, as they very emphatically proved by the investigation that they actually did. So I'll move on to the next sentence. In addition to the concerns listed below, some clinical staff had specific concerns regarding aspects of care of some of these babies, but have not had an opportunity to share these concerns with an investigative team. So this is pretty duplicitous, because Dr. Brearey has spent 2 years essentially poking the other members of clinical staff and trying to induce them to see things the same way that he does. So he is now suggesting that they have some sort of independent concerns about what's occurring on the unit. At the same time, Dr. Brearey has been determined to refer this case to the police, but when Dr. Saladi wrote about this in July 2016, he of course refused or declined to refer the case to the police, and the only reason I can see for this is that would have required some courage, because he would have had to become a whistleblower at that point in time. What we've already established in this video is, even at this stage, even when they've just pestered and pestered and pestered and badgered the executives and tried to intimidate them until they've finally written a letter to the hospital, to the police station, to Cheshire Police, even though, as we know from the meetings that they held with Cheshire Police, the executives do not believe there is any reason for a police investigation. But even despite that has occurred, despite the fact Dr. Saladi said we should write to the police, despite the fact Dr. Brearey did not have the courage to do that because he would have had to put his neck on the line, and even at this stage, he is still not willing to actually deliver this letter himself. Dr. Jairam delivers it to the police, and he sidles in there on the 15th of May, having constantly said, we need to go to the police, this has to go to the police. It goes to the police with him having taken the least amount of risk possible. Then he turns up in court and gives evidence against Lucy Letby, and then after Lucy's convicted, he appears on TV and takes credit for being a whistleblower. In today's video, so finally from Dr. Brearey, in summary, the number of neonatal deaths in this period is highly unusual. The number of unexpected and unexplained collapses is highly unusual. So I think we can agree that the number of neonatal deaths is unusual. It's more debatable whether the number of collapses is unusual. However, they're not unexpected. They're unexpected by you because you refuse to look at any of the reasons for these collapses, and some of the reasons you can't seemingly understand. They're not actually unexpected or unexplained. They're collapses and there are deaths, but we now can fully, now we've seen the full picture of the unit, we can entirely understand why this occurred. The cause of death is still uncertain for 8 babies, so we now know half of these infants are not in the indictment. Many of the babies who died did not respond to adequate resuscitation as would normally be expected. So the reason that they didn't respond to resuscitation is because there was no adequate amount of resuscitation that would have resulted in their recovery. There are probably other incidences where resuscitation was performed poorly, and obviously we know there were intubations that weren't done well and so forth. But it's not that they were given adequate resuscitation. There is no amount of resuscitation that would have resuscitated them. One member of staff has been present during the collapse and or deaths of an unusually high proportion of the babies involved. Yes, we know you do tend to fixate on this quite a bit. The likelihood of this occurring by chance alone is very low. So there's just no way for him to say that. Notice that he's used this expression because earlier on he was talking about the chances of the number of deaths increasing is very low by chance alone. Now he's changed that phrase So he's trying to kind of use the same idea, but now transfer this onto there being one member of staff being present. But we can't really say confidently that that's true, and he definitely can't say that confidently. I mean, Dr. Gibbs actually told him statistically what we're saying could be completely incorrect. And of course, we now know that it is completely incorrect. Investigations and reviews to date have not identified any other potential cause for the increased mortality or been able to exclude an unnatural cause of the deaths and collapses. So, equally, you could say that the reviews never cited an unnatural cause of death or collapse. So you have no reason to believe that there is an unnatural cause, except that you can't face up to the fact that you're the paediatric lead for this unit. You have failed as a paediatric lead. Your unit has failed. You've made mistakes. You shouldn't have been dealing with this acuity of infants. And those are just a few of the problems. In my book, I'll go into a lot more of the problems, and they really are laid out in quite forensic detail so that you can see the problems that were occurring in this hospital, along with the medical errors that occurred on this unit, and the way, as we're going to see in the next section, the way that he characterises and presents the infants to the police, which was then repeated in court, can only be described as farcical. So he goes over the mortality cases of child A. So we've dealt with child A already. Child C is a very obvious bowel obstruction. Please note, this is not over 32 weeks. This is not over 32 weeks. This infant had incredibly poor treatment. Child D, we've dealt with that already. This is not over 32 weeks. Not on the indictment. Not on the indictment. This is not over 32 weeks. Not on the indictment. Not on the indictment. All the way down here, not on the indictment. And then we'll deal with the twins. These are triplets, of course, not twins. These are triplets. So that makes a massive difference. And of course, this infant has a subcapsular hematoma. So we'll deal with all these things later. But let's go down to the actual details. So here's the mortality cases. So I've just dealt with the ones that are on the indictment very briefly, and of course I dealt with them earlier in the video. We'll deal with them again in future videos. And then look how much of all this stuff that he's saying of, oh yeah, there's no reason these infants should have collapsed, blah, blah, blah. Look how much is actually not in the court case, and it's nothing to do with the court case. It's the majority of stuff that he wrote in this report. In today's video, so finally, in summary, the document authored by Dr. Stephen Brearey leans very heavily on the coincidence theory of Lucy Letby being prominently on duty and makes several statistical assertions that are poorly founded. Dr. Brearey makes numerous comments about the state of the infants that do not reflect the clinical picture of these babies. It certainly appears that multiple healthcare professionals on the unit, including Dr. Brearey, have failed to recognise key clinical signs of deterioration in these babies. This contributes to Dr. Brearey's repeated assertion that the deaths and collapses were unexplained and unexpected when there are clear clinical reasons for the difficulties that these infants experienced. I consider the way Dr. Brearey presents acuity and staffing on the unit to be significantly inaccurate. There are other statements made by Dr. Brearey that, in my opinion, come across as misleading or inconsistent with readily available information. When the infants discussed in the court case are examined, their clinical picture is very different from the way Dr. Brearey presents it to Cheshire Police once the non-indictment infants are eliminated. Finally, when the cases were eventually referred to the police, months after Dr. Murthy Saladi first suggested this course of action, it seems that Dr. Brearey was still reluctant to directly send the report that he had primarily authored. Of course, we know what happened in the next few days. On the 12th of May 2017, the executives from the hospital met with Cheshire Police and indicated their view that there was no reason for the police to investigate. The police shared that view at that time until the 15th of May 2017, when Dr. Brearey, Dr. J. Ram, and I'll mention Susie Holt because someone pointed out that I never mentioned her name. That's because she didn't say very much in the meeting, but she was involved with the arranging of the meeting. So these three turn up in the police station and they convince Cheshire Police to investigate. And a lot of the basis for that investigation was the inaccurate information that is contained in this document. And then within 3 days from the 15th of May, by the 18th of May 2017, the police have already told The Guardian that they're going to investigate. So it's a very regrettable series of circumstances, but it's important for us to examine this document so that we can see what Dr. Brearey told the police. Finally, if you've enjoyed this video, it would be appreciated if you could subscribe to the channel. I haven't asked for any subscribers for a while, but they're still ticking up steadily. I'm incredibly appreciative of the nearly 4,000 I have already. It'd be nice to get to 4,000 before Christmas, but it's not absolutely essential. But it'd be nice. It'd be a nice figure to tick off, and then I suppose I can try climbing to 5,000. But the channel's already gone way beyond what I expected. Obviously, I mentioned numerous times I didn't plan to do YouTube, and I certainly didn't plan to become, I would say quite successful. I certainly don't expect to have this number of subscribers, and I'm really grateful for that. I must say that when I was in Manchester, I was recognised a lot, which is really nice. It's nice when people come up to you and say nice things. It does take a little bit of getting used to. As I said, they put me on the ground floor, and literally everyone that walked through the door that was for the meeting knew who I was straight away. So that was a little bit strange, but I'm getting used to it. Everyone's been so nice, so it's not a problem. It's certainly not a problem. It's definitely a positive thing. So yeah, if you could just subscribe if you haven't done so already, and if you could like the video, and if you have any comments to make, I always enjoy reading your comments. I try to answer as many as I possibly can. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to reading what you have to say about this video.